I just found it so fascinating that the campaigns that were put out saying that like porn is a public health issue were not put out by public health people. They were not put out by
Mm.
doctors, scientists, researchers. They were put out by religious organizations.
Okay.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, you know, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hi, Erica.
Hi.
Welcome to Called to Be Bad.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So this is Erica Smith. Her pronouns are she, her. Erica is an award-winning sexuality educator and consultant with over 20 years of experience. She's provided comprehensive sex education and advocacy to young women and LGBTQ plus youth in Philadelphia's juvenile justice system. She's worked in abortion care and supported HIV positive and transgender adolescents and their families. She received her Master's of Education from Widener University Center. Am I saying that right? Okay.
You are, yep.
For human sexuality studies. And in 2019, she developed the Purity Culture Dropout program to help people learn all of the sex education that they missed growing up in purity culture. And that's sex ed that's actually accurate. Queer, inclusive, trauma-informed, compassionate, and comprehensive, which, like, holy cow, if there is not a huge need for that, yeah. Erica lives in Philly with her partner and her house full of rescue animals. Big fan of rescue animals. And you can find her on Instagram at ericasmith.sexed.ed.
Yes.
Which is where I found Erica. I followed her on Instagram because I'm all about the sex education, everything. And also, like, specifically purity culture. Like, that's such an important link. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I also watched, what did you call it? You said porn for purity culture dropouts?
A conversation about porn, or a porn conversation for purity culture dropouts.
Yeah. And so me and my spouse, Nick, we watched that and took that class, and that was so good. And so I immediately reached out to Erica and I was like, could you please come on and can we talk more about this? So we're going to talk about the connections between porn and purity culture. What does it mean to look at porn through a purity culture lens? And what are, like, the general misconceptions about porn that we have been fed by purity culture? So I'm so excited. I'm very passionate about this topic. But before we dive in, I'm curious what you are drinking today, Erica.
Well, it's still morning in Philadelphia, so I'm drinking coffee, and I'm one of those people that, like, kind of continually reheats cups of coffee for hours. So
Yes.
I started drinking this at like 9:30, and I'm still drinking it 2 hours later. So that's what I have.
Me. Yep.
And it's in my little coffee mug that says "Must love pit bulls," because I do. I have 2 pit mixes on the bed with me right now.
Perfect. Love it. And I am also drinking coffee. But thankfully it's nice and hot. I just made it like right before we started. And I like to correlate my mugs with the topic. And so I had to bring out, people who have followed the podcast know this mug. I call this my suggestive bunny mug, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's a bunny rabbit. It's wearing a green shirt that says "wanna." There it goes.
Oh, that's cute. I see that.
And then the back is the back of the bunny, and then there's a question mark. So it's like, oh. Anyways, I got this at a thrift store somewhere, and it made me laugh. And so I've got my suggestive bunny mug. And my good old coffee. Sometime I'll start keeping track of like what actual blend I have, and so I can share, like, not just because I drink coffee every time, but I wanna mix it up and tell people like where the beans are from and get all like coffee snobbery up in here.
Totally.
So, how do you take your coffee?
Just cream, half and half, nothing else.
Okay.
Yep.
Very
Get it
nice.
a nice shade of brown. That's all I need.
Yeah. It's funny that like people gauge their coffee based on color. Like for me, like if I can see, like I just drink it black, and if I
Mm-hmm.
can see the bottom of the mug, I'm like that's
Yeah,
not gonna cut it. It's got to be like
totally.
dark.
Mm-hmm.
And people are like, "Oh, the perfect shade of brown for with cream and sugar or whatever." Hello, beloved baddies. A quick break to tell you that this episode is sponsored by the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, a nonprofit that supports and amplifies the voices of edgewalkers through art that catalyzes change, laughter that brings us together, and soul awakening to the creative spark within us. The support from the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul has meant the world to this podcast. So I highly encourage you to check out their website, arthumorandsoul.com, to see their other featured artists and projects. If you want to support the podcast, you can check out our Patreon or get in touch. Now I'll let you get back to this episode of Called to Be Bad. So yeah, there's no good transition from talking about coffee to porn, is there? I don't know, probably.
I mean,
there might.
Like a more clever. Well, here there actually is a good transition.
Yes, let's hear it.
Everyone takes their coffee differently, just like all of us have very different preferences as to what we find sexually exciting.
Perfect.
And there's coffee for all of us, and every taste you can imagine, and people have also created porn for every taste you can imagine.
Everything, like, if you think of it, it probably already exists.
For sure.
That's just so fascinating to me, that it's like, okay, pick a cartoon, pick any, like, niche, weird thing, and there's probably porn about it. Which is just, it tickles my brain in the sense of like the way memes do, like when you make these weird connections, and like just like how the internet like takes things and runs with it, like that just, I don't know. I find that fascinating. Not saying that all porn is art or artful at all, but it's just like kind of clever to me how people are like, yeah, we're gonna, anyways. So before we talk even more about porn, let's first like establish, like, when you say porn, what do you mean? Like, you, Erica Smith, it doesn't have to be a perfect definition. And I can't help but think of who was it that said like when he asked what porn was, he's like, I don't know what porn is, but I know it when I see it, or whatever.
Yeah, that was the Supreme Court justice who said that, I believe, in the 1960s. Yeah. So there was some rulings coming down about obscenity, quote unquote, and that is a very famous quote from a Supreme Court justice. I know it when I see it. So there is a pretty specific definition of porn, and that is images or depictions of nudity and sexual activity that are specifically for the intent of arousing somebody. So that means that just not everything that is nude or depicting sexual content qualifies as porn, because not everything is meant to arouse us. A medical textbook isn't porn,
Right.
But it is one of those things that people have different definitions of. Some of the things that like very conservative people might consider porn, like an underwear catalog. I don't consider that porn, There was, I know I talked about this in the class, as probably a lot of the stuff we'll talk about today, but there was a crusade to have crusade to have like the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue removed from Walmart checkouts. And because that was being perceived by some people as porn. Right. Where other people might be like, those are nice photos of models, So yeah, it has to have the intent to sexually arouse. And it also has to kind of violate widely held cultural beliefs. So in this case, in America, widely held cultural belief is often that like sex is supposed to be private, sex is supposed to be intimate, and porn, the existence of it kind of violates that widely held, agreed upon belief.
So there's an element of intention. And is that the intention behind the creator or like the publisher or whoever put it out?
Yeah, the intention would be from the creator.
Okay.
But then again, like that gets into messy areas because, what if somebody, yeah, like the creator of an underwear catalog isn't putting it
Mm-hmm.
out there to be like, I'm a pornographer, but other people
Right.
may perceive it that way.
Right. The whole intention versus like impact thing is kind
Hmm.
of interesting with that because there is a level of subjectivity as far as like how it's perceived, but not necessarily how it's put out. So,
Yep.
and then how it crosses some sort of taboo or social, cultural,
Hmm.
um, what's the word?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
belief, an
Yeah.
agreement.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And do you make distinctions between like porn as a general category and then like feminist porn or ethical porn and like if so, how would you define those other categories of porn?
Yeah, so this is a big topic, an interesting topic, and one that, I can speak on from my perspective. But
Mm-hmm.
when somebody says that they have created quote unquote feminist porn, what
Mm-hmm.
that most often means is that it is created by women and that it mostly features the pleasure of women as a front and center activity.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're talking about sort of traditional mainstream porn, that's very clearly made for the arousal of men, for the male
Mm-hmm.
gaze. So we're seeing lots of, close-ups on like just women's body parts, lots of
Mm-hmm.
activity with the penis, and not a ton of things that that are really focused on showing the experience of a woman having pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that aspect of it. So it's made like less for the male gaze and more for women.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other things to consider too, such as, there are people that do believe women want to see more intimacy, storylines, characters. That's a major, it's a generalization to think that
Mm-hmm.
all women who want to watch porn need that aspect of it.
Sure.
But porn that is created from a feminist lens often tends to have more of a like a plot and a story. There's often a focus on emphasizing more diversity in bodies
Mm-hmm.
and more diversity in like, yeah, performer types.
Mm-hmm.
But it's feminist porn and ethical porn are both words or phrases that there's not an across the board definition for them. And what
Right.
one person might say, well, I create feminist porn, another person might be like, yeah, it's not feminist to me.
Yeah.
And then the term ethical porn it's fascinating because
Mm.
it means like porn that was created in conditions where the workers are their comfort and safety is prioritized.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has a say in what's filmed, everyone has a say in who they're going to work with. People are treated well on set, they get the proper breaks, they're properly compensated. But what I learned from people that actually act in porn is to use the term ethical to describe some of it creates a false delineation in the whole industry that
Mm.
anything that isn't coded ethical means it's bad in some way,
Okay.
which is so interesting because I mean, I hadn't thought about that till I got that feedback from women that are in the industry. And they were like, it's actually a bit harmful to our industry when people say this porn is ethical, because that means people think, well, if it doesn't call itself ethical, then something, it must be created in a harmful way.
Mm.
So another thing that I would say when it comes to ethical is some people will say that their porn is ethical because it doesn't feature certain kind of like storylines or power dynamics. It might not feature kink that involves like choking and,
Mm.
stuff like that. But if all of that is done consensually because people like it and because people want to see it, that's still ethical.
Right.
So sometimes people mistake the term ethical porn to mean it's all going to be like quite vanilla,
Mm,
and it's all going to depict like, loving relationships, but that is
right.
so subjective. That is
Hmm.
very much up to the individual person as to what they personally feel is ethical.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no like ethics committee that says,
No.
okay, this was produced ethically and the content is ethical, and there's no standard, or like, if you're into ethics, like, okay, but by what is your standard of ethics? Like, is it an ethic
Hmm.
of harm? Is it, like, what kind of ethics are we talking here?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So that label, I've often heard it compared to like it's about as useful as the word organic.
Oh,
Organic can mean different things to different people. Somebody
okay.
might call their product organic for reasons that, you know, other people might not. And you can't look at something because it calls itself organic and be like, well, everything about this is safe or good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And we're also like looking at porn through the lens of purity culture. And so we've done episodes on purity culture before, but if you could talk about maybe why you view it through the lens of purity culture and how you also define purity culture.
Yeah. So a definition of purity culture that I usually go back to when asked is a definition that Linda K. Klein put out. And Linda K. Klein, the author of the book Pure.
Mm-hmm.
And the way she defines purity culture is it is a system of very strict control around gender or sexuality
Mm,
that is not unique to white evangelical Christianity. It actually, there are elements of it in all major world religions, but
right.
it is a system of control around gender and sexuality. And
Mm,
so when we're talking about American purity culture, we're usually thinking about um, evangelicals and a church movement that really gained traction in the 90s and the 2000s and became an industry.
mm-hmm.
And so I want to make clear, I always share this, but I didn't grow up in purity culture. I grew up
Oh.
in a family that was pretty casually Christian, like
Mm,
we went to church like on Christmas. You know what
yeah.
I mean? That was
Yeah.
like, that was about it. But the purity culture view of porn and the like evangelical view of porn is that every single aspect of all of it is bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I, the reason I decided to teach this class is because when I work one on one with clients, they would tell me about all the things they learned growing up and all the beliefs that were instilled upon them. And they would often talk about like campaigns such as Porn Kills Love
Mm,
and Fight the New Drug. And I thought, that's really interesting. And I started looking into those campaigns and realizing that they are deeply based on a lot of faulty science,
mm,
and that the organizations putting out these campaigns were religious organizations, the Mormon Church, for one, um, and that there was no room for any other kind of nuance around the subject. It was just like, it's bad, it's always bad, it's exploitive, it hurts people, it ruins lives. And my experience as someone who's been a sex educator for a long time and has, studied certain types of pornography and watched many types of it, I've never, you know, my own personal experience is that like this isn't across the board like as bad as everyone is being taught.
mm,
And I leave it up to the individual to decide how they feel about it and what it means to them and if it has a place in their lives at all. I just found it so fascinating that the campaigns that were put out saying that like porn is a public health issue were not put out by public health people. They were not put out by
mm,
doctors, scientists, researchers. They were put out by religious organizations.
mm,
And so what I learned in preparing for this class is that a lot of the conservative religious orgs from the 70s that were really upset about porn, they pivoted to make it sound like a secular thing, like it's a public health issue, it harms your brain. But it's the same people behind the message. They rebranded their message for younger people. So, I talk about this in the class, but like,
Yeah.
they're selling their Porn Kills Love merch to like cool looking hip young people.
Right.
And I know a lot of the clients I've worked with are like, oh yeah, I totally had one of those shirts, So yeah, that's the purity culture lens through which porn is seen, is that it is unequivocally harmful.
Right. And you're asking the question, why is it harmful? How is it harmful? If you weren't looking at porn through the lens of like, this is sin, or God thinks it's bad, or the Bible says it's wrong, where is the harm? Where is the nuance? And also, like, can we ask people other than, because it's not just Christians that are that would maybe have concerns about porn. But if there are valid concerns, can they be outside of a lens of like, this is sin, period? Like, well, okay, why? Or
yeah. And that's just to touch on that for a second. Yeah. It was realized by church leadership that just telling people it was a sin wasn't enough to like stop people from being interested, and wasn't enough to like dismantle the industry. So they're like, well, we got to make it sound more we got to add some weight to why we don't think it's good, right? Not just say it's a sin.
Right. People are like, it's a sin. Oh, interesting. I'm gonna go check that out.
Yeah, and then ask for forgiveness, right?
Right. And then it starts the cycle all over again. Yeah, and broader than like porn, I think as soon as we are told something is bad or wrong, or like, it's like the whole like banned books thing. Like banned books become the most popular books because people are curious, and as soon as they're told you can't do something or you shouldn't do something, then it makes you want to do it so much more.
Totally. I often compare it to restriction with diets, which sometimes leads to like binge eating of the same of the thing you're saying you're not allowed to have.
Yes. The restriction causes the excess or causes the harm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I might be jumping ahead in our conversation, but one thing that I find so interesting and really, really just like helpful to know is that, the studies about men who report porn addiction shows that the number one reason they're saying they're addicted is because they feel so much shame about it. And when they are given like the green light to be like, porn's, it's neutral, you can watch it, you can, it's, if you don't want to, no big deal. When the shame factor is removed, the desire to watch the porn like drops significantly.
Yep. Yeah, let's talk about like, let's go into like misconceptions about porn and porn addiction. Is porn addiction real? Should people be concerned? That kind of thing.
I love talking about this particular topic. So I want to start out by saying I and sex researchers are not denying that people's porn use can become problematic and can cause, what's the word? Like harm in their lives, can be disruptive to their lives, can hurt people in their lives. So nobody is saying that there's no such thing as problematic behavior around porn.
Right.
But the public's understanding, the general like layperson's understanding of what addiction is very different than what addiction actually is clinically. And when researchers have studied like the brain, the reaction of men, specifically men, their brain when they watch pornography does not exhibit the behavior that an addict's brain exhibits when they drink or when they do drugs. There's actually a reduction in the brain activity when a self-reported porn addict views pornography. So what I've learned in doing a lot of this research for my class is that to say porn is an addiction and to treat it like an addiction is actually harming people who would be better served by an intervention that is actually proven by evidence to work for the issues that they're dealing with. So if you take someone who's like, a guy that just watches porn occasionally, and maybe his partner has been told her whole life that that's horrible, it's dishonoring their marriage, and so she tells him, you're an addict. He believes he's an addict. He feels so much shame about that. To send that man to a rehab is not the answer. It's actually harmful for people. And I have talked to men, I've had clients, and I've just heard people sharing their stories with me, like over, DM and over social media, about how they went to these religious-based recovery places and were like humiliated and told, that they were like so bad, and that it made them feel like really, really awful, and didn't do anything to actually address the issues they were concerned about. So thinking of porn use, problematic porn use through an addiction lens is not helpful. But the people that run these rehabs that are very mostly religious based don't want the science out there about how it's not an addiction, because that would ruin a whole industry.
It would defund their programs.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is
And
so
the researchers
sad. Go ahead.
The researchers who have found this research have been threatened and harassed, just because they found results saying that the brain does not behave as if porn is an addiction.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And that's so sad because, like, ultimately you would want the goal to be helping people, not just like funding these programs that are anti-porn. It should be about people and wholeness and health, not like we're going to stick to deciding that this is wrong.
Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting because when you talk about the harm that can come with porn use, I've not heard people make the distinction between the harm that comes, say one partner watches porn and the other person believes it's wrong. We don't talk about the harm that can come with the person that continues to watch porn and deceives their partner, and lies about it, or does it in hiding, like is secretive about it. Because that's a different type of harm. The deception and lies is a different type of harm than the actual watching of the porn.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And that's relational. That's about your relationship. That's about your communications. That's about your agreed upon standards of how you're going to behave.
Yeah.
And, I really encourage couples to have conversations about what watching porn means to them and how they feel about it, and if it has a place in their lives.
Because if you view porn as a form of cheating, that's taking it to a different level of harm. Again, like you were saying, it's relational harm rather than like an ethical or even a spiritual problem of viewing people having sex. Like those are distinct issues, distinct behaviors. Yeah, interesting. We kind of touched on this a little bit about the shame, but I wanna really underline this because this is what stood out to me the most in your class, was that the shame surrounding porn usage was more detrimental than the act of watching porn itself. And yeah, repeat what you were saying about when you remove the shame, what happens?
When in the preliminary studies that have been done, when you remove the shame factor, the behavior that, many people perceive as an addiction changes. It becomes less taboo, and therefore there's less compulsivity around it. And, one of the biggest predictor of a person reporting that they're a porn addict is religion. People being raised in, controlling religion or very conservative religion, that is the number one factor of someone saying that they're a porn addict. So it's like, again, I'm not saying that people can't exhibit problematic behavior around porn that affects their relationship or their lives, but being told that any viewing of porn is addiction has created like so many people whose viewing habits are probably pretty modest, reporting themselves as addicted and repenting and, feeling so much shame about it. Like, I spoke to a man before who said he probably looked at porn like 4 or 5 times a whole year, and he still was sent to a rehab program
Oh,
at the
wow.
suggestion of his like religious leader and his wife. And, somebody who has a more sex positive view would say that like that's pretty normal behavior and nothing to pathologize.
Yeah.
And by telling men in particular that they are like weak and terrible and dishonoring their family, we're just fueling the shame, which fuels the compulsive behavior.
Yeah. I'm making connections right now between like Christians, if they view behaviors as sin, and not only is the behavior sinful or problematic, it's an indicator of a character flaw that people like. If you believe that people are inherently sinful, then it's part of your being to sin. And then I'm connecting that to the idea of lust. So like, especially when I was in college, I didn't super grow up in purity culture, but I was very much introduced to it in college, my first 2 years of college. And lust was presented as a character flaw. Like you either had a lust problem or you didn't. It wasn't like, oh, I dabble in lust. And so like if people like say these folks who watch porn, if then they interpret that as I have a lust problem, I have a character flaw, I have an addiction that needs to be rooted out, exercised, fixed, then it makes sense to me that then they would be put into these programs that aren't scientifically backed or
Totally
actually helpful, because they're like, oh, this is something that needs to be rooted out and fixed and prayed away.
Yeah. And, lust problem to me is like such a strange way to explain the incredibly human, incredibly natural sexual desire that most people experience at some point.
Right.
That's how we perpetuate the species,
Right. Sexual feelings, sexual attraction, and beyond that, I think sex is often more about connection, of being seen by others, of being accepted by others. And so it's not just like it is like a sexual urge, and it's also a desire for connection. And if you're Christian, we talk about that all the time, about our desire for connection with other people comes from our desire to connect with God. And then we're going to go and place a label of sin on that we're also saying is from God. Like, that's so confusing.
Deeply.
I'm getting worked up. Okay. So you during your presentation, you brought a sex worker on to share about their experience. And that was super helpful. I really appreciated that, because we weren't just talking about sex workers. We were talking with a sex worker, and she was able to share from her experience. And yeah, I wish that I would have done that on this show. Maybe we'll have someone on sometime.
Yeah.
But yeah, what was your goal behind bringing a sex worker on, and how does it benefit to actually talk to someone rather than talking about them?
Yeah, I mean, that's the reason I brought her on, is because if we're going to have a conversation about the pornography industry, I want to hear about it from someone that's actually in it. I can read about it, you can read about it, but until we talk to someone who has experienced it, I don't think we're getting the full picture. And, so her name is Siri. She has been, she talked about how she was in the industry for a few years, left for a little while, and came back. And so she has like such an interesting perspective, and she also really, really enjoys her work. And I think it's important to hear that, because when you have the big anti-porn organizations, they have been criticized by sex workers for not listening to sex workers, for leaving sex workers out of the conversation. They've been criticized by viewing all sex work as trafficking, when in
Yeah.
reality, there is a difference between being coerced and being forced and doing something of your own free will. But the big like anti-porn organizations do not recognize the free will of performers. They're like, oh no, they're all being exploited. It's all very sad. And they steamroll them and don't listen to their voices. So to have somebody who actually works in the industry, who likes her job, who can share perspective about, yeah, what's it actually like on a set? What's it like to work with someone? What's it like to be a porn star and like retain a relationship with your family? Like all of those things,
Yeah.
I think are so interesting and important to talk about. And hearing it directly from her is, yeah, I think that there's nothing more powerful than that, like as an educational tool.
And I'll just quickly plug Erica's work, your work, and just say like, if you like, can people go and like purchase the class that I took?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's called like a porn. I can't remember if I called it a porn conversation or a
Conversation
conversation
about
about
porn.
porn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is it's available for purchase on my website. If you go to purityculturedropout.com,
Yeah.
you can find books. Well, I wrote one workbook about sexual values, but you can find that and all of the classes that I have taught and recorded. And you can purchase the class recording for the porn class.
Yeah.
And along with that comes a very large, well-researched list of my references that I
Yeah.
used. So if you're like, well, I don't trust Erica, she just is throwing out these like studies, I put the studies in the resource
You're
list.
like, I have my receipts, I have my
I have,
footnotes, my
yeah.
bibliography.
And I mean,
Yeah.
it's extensive.
Yeah.
And I also put in, you know, for people who were like, well, I am curious about exploring porn, but I want to make sure that I consume it in an ethical fashion, meaning I'm consuming it from, you know, verified adults who are creating it of their own volition. I've also put in the resources like the websites and the ways to do that.
Yeah. And another thing that I really appreciated about your class was from the get-go, you were like, look, I'm not here to tell you that porn is right or wrong. Like, I'm not, you were not putting a morality stamp on it either way. But you were saying, like, if you want to learn about porn, here are ways to do it. And here's how to investigate your sources for these studies. Like, you debunked the one that was like, people at the earliest age of like 11 or 14 first discover porn. And you're like, okay, well, like, let's look a little harder at this and see who put out the studies, why they put out the studies, who was funding the studies. And so I really appreciated that you were like, okay, let's actually do our research. And I like that you were saying, okay, the dominant narrative around porn, especially within like Christian circles or purity culture, is that porn is wrong and bad and sinful and terrible. So what is the other perspective? And let's just explore that, and not saying that you have to immediately swing over and saying like, okay, porn is good, great, like let's watch it, you know.
Yeah.
Like without let's watch it without consuming it critically. Like that's not what you were saying. But you're like, what's the other side of the story? And especially bringing Siri on and allowing her to tell her story was incredibly helpful. And I think for me personally, for about like 5 years, porn has felt like almost like this puzzle in my brain that I've wanted to solve. Like I wanted to decide, is it good or bad? Is it right or wrong? I want to know my stance on it. I want to know about it. Because I learn a lot about sex and sexuality. And so it just like felt like this puzzle. And taking your class and listening to your work kind of gave me space to be like, okay, can we hold nuance? Can we hold space in our brain for things to be more than just like right or wrong or good or bad?
Yeah.
And also I really cling on to this idea that it's the shame that is piled on that is causing more harm than the actual viewing of people having sex. Yeah, that's huge. And that's true in more areas, like you were saying with food. It's true in more areas than then, I mean, man, cough, cough, the church, like if we could stop like shaming people, could we actually cultivate greater wholeness and healing?
Mm-hmm.
So that was a rant.
It was a good one.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, anyways, all that was to say, I really appreciate your perspective that you brought to the conversation.
Thank you.
So if you like had an audience with like everyone in the world, or let's just say more particularly people that have gone through or experienced purity culture and have been told that their desires are bad or wrong or sinful, what would you like to tell the world about purity culture or porn?
I would want people to know that it is so important to be critical of who is feeding you the information about pornography. If you look hard enough, very often you will find that it is from churches and organizations who believe that the only acceptable expression of sexuality is in the confines of a heterosexual marriage. And that the actual, concern about people being exploited in trafficking it was a rebrand to make it appeal to people. But behind all of that is these organizations that are just church organizations that I don't want them teaching me about any aspect of sexuality. So why would I trust them to teach me the truth about porn? That there are many other places to get information from, but you have to dig and you have to be critical about it. So yeah, that's what I would want people to know, that the evangelical church has hijacked the whole conversation in this country, and they shouldn't be the only voice. That I think it's more important to listen to sex workers.
Yeah. Can we complicate the narrative? Yeah. No, I appreciate that. So I'm curious, I ask everyone who comes on the show this question. So how would you respond? What would be your, first before we ask, like, what would be your like label here? I don't know if you consider yourself Christian, or we could just say like bad person or sex educator.
I guess a bad person. Yeah.
Okay. What would you say if someone said that you were a bad person because you are complicating this narrative around purity culture and porn?
I would, people can believe what they want, but as an educator, I am here to give people all of the information I can find and let them make their own decisions about it, which is how I operate on any sexuality topic. So if I'm teaching you about STI prevention, I'm going to tell you all that I know, but it's up to you to decide how to incorporate that into your life. So I don't think that being an educator and being the one to provide people with information is bad or wrong. And that's actually something, I'm glad you asked that, because sex educators are very under attack in this country right now, because we have been accused of grooming and we've been accused of like being inappropriate, and we give information to people. That's what we do.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a theory behind why Christians often push back against these kinds of, like, if you're bringing up critical race theory or sex education, the pushback is that we are grooming children or leading people to deception or whatever. And I think it's because in those circles they are taught to accept what information is given to them from authority figures. So when they hear their pastor say XYZ, they're taught to accept that. This is what the Bible says. This is what God wants, and not interact with that critically. And so then they apply that framework to other areas of information, assume that everyone else is just kind of blindly accepting whatever information they are fed, rather than thinking critically about it. And it's like, God gave us, if you believe God created us, God gave us brains to use and discern and, like you were saying, like kind of do the research ourselves and figure out what is right for you. What is good for you.
It's always a red flag to me when somebody is like, no, don't provide this type of education. Teachers get it. Librarians are getting it.
Yeah.
Anytime someone wants to keep a population ignorant, that is a red flag. Like that happened in Nazi Germany. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice for anyone? I'm picturing someone listening who has been taught their entire life that watching porn or reading erotica or listening to erotica or even viewing a swimsuit magazine is wrong. And they're kind of in that shame cycle. What would you say to that person? What advice would you give them?
I would say to remember that as human beings, having sexual thoughts, feelings, and desires is a very natural part of the human experience. And the reason we like to look at sexualized images is because it fuels, those very natural parts of ourselves. So there is nothing wrong with you if you get turned on by looking at images, if you get turned on by the looking at other people having sex on camera. That's how our brains are wired. And we have complicated it deeply and made people feel horrible just for having that urge. And if you are concerned about people being exploited in the creation of pornography, I completely understand that because it does happen. And there are ways to make sure that you are not, unintentionally watching videos where people are harmed.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me of Emily Nagoski in Come As You Are. She talks about how your brain sees something. Say even you see like someone in a swimsuit, and say your brain interprets that as like say you get turned on from just looking at someone in a swimsuit. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. Or if you watch something and you're like, that's not sexy, but your body starts doing things, it's because your brain interprets it as sexually relevant.
Yep.
And then it kicks off that physiological process.
Yeah, and we don't have control over that.
Right, and it doesn't line up with your ethics. It doesn't go, it bypasses that kind of ethical part of our brain that decides like, oh, I want to be turned on, or this is an appropriate thing to be turned on by. Our brain still gets turned on by things that we think are inappropriate or unethical or wrong, but that doesn't mean that we like want to partake in that activity or that we should partake in that activity. Or that we are sinful, bad, deranged, unevolved beings. Yeah. It's just our brain is interpreting it as sexually relevant. And if we can just say, sexually relevant and move on with our day and not dip into that shame cycle of I'm a terrible person.
And I also will say this, just because we see something that arouses us doesn't mean that we are going to have to act on it. Like we have control over our behavior in that regard.
Yes.
And I think one of the big purity culture lies is that sexual thoughts and feelings are, quote, a runaway train off the tracks, and then you're just going to be out there like having sex with everyone and doing all kinds of things that don't fit your personal code of ethics. And that's not true. Like you have agency. Just because you get turned on by something doesn't mean that you are going to turn into like a violent predator.
Right.
At all.
Yeah. Think about all the times that, well, I'll speak for myself. I have all the intrusive thoughts of like, hey, you should trip that child. What? Yeah. I don't want to trip a child. And it's the second thought that matters. The second thought of like, no, that would not be a very kind thing to do. And then it's like, okay, I'm not going to trip the child. I don't know why I tripped them. Whatever. Just treat it as like, and by intrusive, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's just an unwanted thought or something that you didn't control. Well, it's tradition on Called to Be Bad to end with a blessing. So would it be okay Let me try that again. Would it be okay, Erica, if I bless you and all the baddies out there watching and listening?
Absolutely. I would be honored.
And I hear you have dogs there
I
too.
do. I
That
can
that I
show
would love to bless.
this baby. We can bless Ranger.
Hi, Ranger. Sleeping puppy dog.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Erica and all of you baddies out there watching or viewing this podcast episode, and Ranger, of course, and your other dog, may you go from this space knowing that you are good, you are whole, you are loved. And it's okay to not know if something is right or wrong or good or bad. It's okay to lean into the nuance to figure out if something is good for you. And feelings of shame do not determine your worth. You are worthy no matter what. Amen.
Amen. Beautiful.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Erica, for coming
You're
on.
welcome.
This has been awesome. That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.